Hi everyone, Carl Steele here, English 4101, talking about the Canarian. This work is written in the early part of the 15th century and is a record of a couple of French aristocrats who, with their cronies, sought to conquer Canary Islands, which is a body of islands off the northwest coast of Africa. And they weren't the first Europeans to encounter these islands. Italians had made contact with them in the later 13th and early 14th centuries, but this is the first sustained effort to try to conquer them. And it's important, among other reasons, because it's kind of dry run for what would happen in the Caribbean less than 100 years later. So what we have is a very well-developed military and political group that is going to encounter people who don't have the kind of political organization and the military technology to resist being conquered and forcibly either enslaved or converted to Christianity, or wiped out, or all three, in fact, which is more or less what happened in the Canary Islands. So, but it's also interesting just as a record of the disagreements between the French, that although it tries to present itself as a noble attempt at conquest and at spreading the word of Christ, it really is in fact a kind of record of two French men who are just at each other's throats all the time and constantly undercutting each other. So it's almost kind of unintentionally funny. What's interesting to me for this is the way that this text doesn't really yet know the script for doing this kind of conquest. It's going to become old hat by the time, certainly by the time we get into the 19th century. But Europeans are just starting to figure out how to do this kind of thing. And so when we have, for example, this representation of baptism in this unusual section that's about turning the Canary Islands Christian, we have this representation of the King of Lanzarote coming to Monsieur de Betancourt to be baptized. And you will notice the way that these people are portrayed in this particular manuscript. So here are the French on this side, and they're dressed in up-to-date fashions of around the year 1400. And the Canary Islanders here are depicted as different according to their facial hair and according to their minimal clothing, as opposed to this full set of clothing over here. But skin color is not rendered as different. Facial features are not rendered as different. Size of the people is not rendered as different. It doesn't really have the same script of representing the baptism of colonial subjects that you're certainly going to find in like 19th century representations of missionary work or 20th century representations of missionary work. And so in terms of the history of the representations of human difference and of European colonialism and of European sort of forcible missionary work, this is an interesting example because it's sort of an instance where the illustrator of this manuscript doesn't yet know how to do the kinds of things that are going to be happening in later centuries. So we can also look at the long section, which contains the kind of minimal elements of Christianity that the Canary Islanders are supposed to know. This stuff is really unusual, and I don't really know what to do with it. I just want to call attention to it so we can talk about it in class. So here's Noah's Ark. And we can say, well, why would someone who just converted from Christianity need to know about Noah's Ark? That's the first question. But then there's this bit here too about how they made the wood stick together. They used something called bitumen. Bitumen is a glue so strong and tenacious that when two pieces are brought together and joined with it, they cannot be separated by any means except by the natural blood of women's flowers, that is, by menstruation. Why say this? Why is this being offered to these brand new Christians who are presumably converting under sword point? I don't really know, but I want to just offer that up to the class as something we can maybe hypothesize about. Similarly, we have this instructing them in the fundamental features of something called typology, which is the notion that the old law prefigures what happens in the new law. So the bronze serpent that Moses sets up in the wilderness anticipates Christ, who is also suspended and portrayed to people and also heals and defends and protects, et cetera, and cures them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this notion that the so-called Old Testament is fulfilled or completed by the New Testament, this Christian notion, is something that's again being offered up to these brand new Christians. And that's also extremely strange. We can ask, well, why is that? Why is this sort of attitude about old versus new being offered to people who have never even encountered any form of the Bible, right? I also want to call attention to this particular illustration of Moses. So here's Moses here before the Ten Commandments. You'll notice he has horns. This has to do with a mistranslation out of the Hebrew by, I believe, by Jerome into the Latin Vulgate, which is the primary version of the Bible that's available in the West. And basically, he took a bit in the Hebrew that talks about Moses as having shining when he returns from Mount Sinai carrying the tablets, and his face is shining because he's encountered God. And Jerome reads that as saying that he has horns, and that's the reason why Moses is represented for so many centuries in Christian art as somebody who has horns, including by Michelangelo, for example. So the thing that I'm really interested in, though, is this particular image and the kind of images like it in this manuscript. So this is an image of a shield. It's either going to be Bertencourt's heraldic device, this lion, or Gadifer. I'm not sure which one. It's not super important to me. And it's being held up by two Canary Islanders. I presume that's what they're meant to represent. And what that reminds me of is the way that wild men become incredibly important in heraldry. And then they start to become important in heraldry around the year 1370 or so, 1375. So maybe 20 to 25 years before the Canarian gets written. And then they really achieve a peak around the year 1500 or so. And so here's a manuscript from the Morgan Library of two wild men holding up a shield. And you can read more about this in a book by Richard Bernheimer, Wild Men in the Middle Ages from 1952. It's a classic. Timothy Husband from an exhibit at the Met 1980, The Wild Man, Medieval Myth and Symbolism. So there's a book associated with that. And we have basically Bernheimer will argue that the wild men represent sort of a kind of protective device for the shield. They're just so powerful. They show the shield being protected, but they're also, the wildness is something the aristocrats want to associate themselves with, to say both that we're civilized and also that we're somewhat wild. And we can draw on either one of those energies as we see fit. And I think perhaps that's some of what's happening here in this image. But it's also suggests the way that the people of the Canary Islands are going to be talked about in European writing, and how they're going to draw on the language that's already available for thinking about something they call wildness or barbarian life. It's things like that. That is, they have a kind of prejudicial script that they're drawing on when they're trying to make sense of these people that they've encountered. So I have, for example, in mind this work by Petrarch on the solitary life. It's a philosophical work by the person who gave us, of course, the Petrarchan sonnet, written in mostly in 1346. And he's talking about how to be a good scholar. You need to be alone most of the time. And he says that the Canary Islanders, whom he's heard of, have the wrong kind of solitary life, that they're alone in the wrong way. And so he says those people enjoy solitude beyond nearly all other men, but are without refinement in their habits, and so little unlike brute beasts, that their action is more the outcome of natural instinct than of rational choice. And you might say that they do not so much lead the solitary life as roam about in solitudes, either with wild beasts or with their flocks. And so this might remind you of some of the things we've encountered in Mandeville. It might remind you of Bertrandus of Corbie writing about the cynocephaly. It also might remind you of Ibn Tufayl writing about Hayab and Yuxin. It's all these things are being drawn upon in Petrarch's work. So what I have in mind is a work by someone I went to graduate school with, Shireen Khan Mohammadi, in her work In Light of Another's Word, European Ethnography in the Middle Ages. And she talks about something called the Barbarian Script. And she provides an example of it here from Thomas Aquinas, a 13th century theologian. In his commentary on Aristotle's Politics, describes barbarians as people who lack reason because they live in places that are too cold or too hot. And it makes them kind of stupid as a result of it. And that they're basically rendered irrational and almost brutal. That is almost like animals. And so this is the Barbarian Script. And they're not writing this on the basis of encounters with any actual people. They're writing on the basis of what they know from reading works like by Aristotle or works by Cicero, basically classical works. And they're just repeating and developing ideas that they have seen elsewhere. And so the basic elements of that Barbarian Script are that humans are reasonable, lawful, and robust in mind. Barbarians, who are distinct from humans, are unreasonable, robust in body, lawless or ruled by irrational laws and evil customs, lacking the technology of writing. And when someone has been turned into a barbarian, they have been they're available basically to be enslaved, to be forcibly converted to Christianity, to be treated like animals, or even to be wiped out. And all these things variously happened to the Canary Islanders. And so, but that's not the only way that these people might be talked about. There's also a kind of golden age idea. And we encountered that in Mandeville when he's talking about the relationship between Alexander the Great and the Brahmins or the naked philosophers, Didymus, the king of those people, who says basically we don't have private property, we live a life of purity, we don't eat meat and so on, and we don't do all these things that you do, and we live therefore a much more peaceful and holy life than you do. And so here's an illustration of Golden Age people from a work called The Romance of the Rose. It's a 13th century kind of encyclopedic medieval work. And you can see they're having a nice time, they're eating fruit, they're hanging out with their animals peaceably, they're not eating meat, they're dressed very minimally. And something like that is also maybe being activated in this manuscript when it's talking about the people of the Canary Islands. So is it drawing more on that kind of barbarian script or the Golden Age script when talking about these people? And that's something we can talk about in class. But there are ways in which it also kind of breaks the script and unusual things happen. So there's this king who's kind of an escape artist. I say he escapes for the first time. It's actually the sixth time when he's escaping here. And he's being compared basically to Jesus, because it says the people who betrayed him and tried to enslave him are like Judas Iscariot. They're like the person who betrayed Jesus to the Romans. It's an unusual analogy and something I hope we can talk about at length in class. And so this is neither the Barbarian script nor the Golden Age script. It's a different kind of script, and it kind of indicates that when these French adventurers landed in the Canary Islands and they're trying to make sense of things, there are ways that their usual way of talking about things is going to fail them, and they're going to be a little bit confused, and interesting things will happen as a result of that. But I want to mention one last thing, which is that, in fact, that image I've been showing you, this one here, the text down here is this, and it talks about the language that these people speak. The country is inhabited by a tall people who speak the most remarkable of all the languages of these islands and speak with their lips as if they had no tongues. This is a description of an actual language which still exists to this day. So although most of the native peoples of Gomera were wiped out, enough of them survived and have managed to preserve some elements of their culture, including their language, and Spanish settlers and colonialists, etc., drew upon some of that linguistic stuff, and they have managed to preserve that language to this day. And it's something called the Gomeran whistle, which is a whistled register of Spanish used by the inhabitants of La Gomera and the Canary Islands to communicate across the deep ravines and narrow valleys that radiate through the island. So in this era of cell phones, it's probably not as useful as it used to be, but in the days before there were telephones of any sort or telegraphs of any sort, you can imagine that a language that expresses basic ideas through whistling could be really, really useful in the kind of harsh landscape of Gomera. And so here's a place where we could say this doesn't really fit either the Golden Age script or the Barbarian script or even the Canary Islanders as Jesus script. It's something where these French people have encountered this, and they're just end up writing down what they know, and they try to make sense of it. And it becomes this kind of fascinating preservation of something that that just doesn't fit any of the available prejudices. And we can talk about how that works as well in class. So I'm looking forward to our discussion this Thursday, next Tuesday, on this text.